Okay, morning everyone, and thank you so much for joining this session, highlighting the role of social connections and communities' ability to cope with drought in Somalia. My name is Jennifer Mayer, and I'm the Climate Resilient Ag and Natural Resource Management Advisor on the ProWash and Scale Award, which is a learning award funded by USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance that supports capacity strengthening and research for BHA implementing partners around the world. We focus on the sectors of ag, natural resource management, integrated water resource management, livelihoods, and WASH. And joining me this morning from the ProWash and Scale side is my colleague Bella. So if you have any technical issues during the session, please reach out to either of us and we can help. I will just say really quickly that unfortunately there was not enough demand among the registrants for interpretation. So this event will be held in English, and I apologize to anyone who was hoping for French interpretation. It was just there were so few that we couldn't really manage to do the interpretation for this event. And then I also wanted to mention that while we'll have time during the session for questions and discussion, if you have any questions in the meantime, please do drop them in the chat and we will get to them as we go. So I'd like to start off by introducing today's presenters. We have Jafar Hassan, who's the Chief of Party for the Somalia Resilience Population Measurement, or RPM, program at Mercy Corps, and is based in Mogadishu, Somalia, where he leads the development of a user-centered resilience measurement system in USAID's focal zones. He has deep experience working with key resilience consortia and has contributed extensively to resilience approaches and practices in Somalia. And then we have Jerome Galagade, who is the Monitoring and Evaluation Manager for the Somalia Resilience Program, or SomReP, where he has been instrumental in leading collaborations with the government to refine the program's annual resilience measurement, or ARM, methodology and conduct seasonal assessment reviews. We're so happy to have you both with us today, Jerome and Jafar. It's going to be a great discussion. And then I wanted to take a minute to go through the run of show for today's session. We're going to run it a little bit differently, more as a peer-to-peer interview between Jafar and Jerome, clustered around 3 key questions about what they're seeing from the research in Somalia. As part of each question cluster, we're going to open it up to the audience to reflect on how the findings that are being shared might affect the way that we work as practitioners, whether in terms of designing and targeting programs, implementing them on the ground, or monitoring them. But first, let's have a little bit more background on each of these incredible programs. And I'm going to turn it over to Jafar just to take a minute to tell us a little bit more about RPM. Over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, ProWash and Scale team. It's a pleasure to be here with you. So overall, I'll try to give you an overview of Resilience Population Measurement Program, with the overall goal of the program being trying to understand measurement at population level and identify capacities that matter in the geographical focal zone for Somalia, for USAID, which is primarily the south central of Somalia. This is a 5-year USAID program. It has 2 objectives. Objective 1 is trying to build a common understanding on resilience and also trying to see how individual programs are contributing to resilience. While in the second objectives, we are looking forward to doing mixed method research that's trying to estimate or identify the resilience capacities that matter at population measurement. Next. So I'll just give a small context on the research we are currently presenting. Was collected during the recent drought in 2022. Although the drought persisted for 6 failed consecutive rainy seasons, the data that we are presenting was collected on the fourth season after the fourth season failure. Remember, this is the drought, the worst drought in 50 years in the Horn of Africa and in Somalia, with 7.1 million people were affected. Overall, the context is in the first two seasons, people were able to rely on their previous stocks and their all the savings. However, as the third and the fourth season gained, we realized that there is more and more of challenges coming ahead. And this was not happening in a vacuum. On top, as you can see, we have other shocks that are also compounding this problem, that including COVID, the recent pest crisis, that is the locust that we came out from, and the conflict and others alongside. So the discussions that we're going to share today are happening within this premise during that period of time on some of the research that we talked about. I'll give back to Jerome now to give us a bit of introduction about SomReP. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Yep, Jerome, take it away.
Thank you very much. So, as introduced by Jane, I'm Jerome. So I'll speak about SomReP, and SomReP was formed in around 2012 or 2013, and this was after the 2011 famine. And this is basically area-based MAT sector and MAT actor material program. NGOs came together in around 2012 to explore ways of being proactive in building resilience and protecting gains so people can overcome shocks. As of now, there are 8 member NGOs. It's an 8-member NGO where we have 7 international organizations and 1 local NGO. And within SomReP, there is a response innovation lab that is hosted within, where there's currently we broker innovations and new ways of working. And also SomReP hosts Resilience Nexus Learning Action Network, where we're trying to promote capacity strengthening and localization across Somalia, Sudan, and South Sudan. Next. And in SomReP, we have a specific measuring analytical framework that we measure resilience. And this is through the famous Tango: absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacity. So we measure resilience through these 3 main resilience capacities. And we also do this across also looking at also well-being indicators, well-being outcome indicators, where we're looking at how households there's improved income, improved dietary diversity, household hunger, coping strategy index, and diversified income. And this is we conduct this resilience measurement on an annual basis. So that's our annual resilience measurement. And we use this framework to measure resilience across all SomReP locations. Next. So in this webinar, we sent our analysis on the 3 district groups. So as we do our annual resilience measurement, we conduct across district, across locations, and we focus on this one, we focus on 3, which are agro-pastoralist, peri-urban, and pastoral households in SomReP locations, with the understanding that each has unique livelihood vulnerabilities and coping mechanisms. And we will compare and present our findings by comparing ARM data, annual resilience measurement data from 2020 to 2022. And from there, we observe trends and potential shifts in communal behaviors and attitudes in relation to social connectedness. And our outcome of interest is the community's members' likelihood to provide support to others, which is a direct measure of social cohesion and resilience. And we will note, as we present the findings, that the different community groups or livelihood groups showcase varied reactions to similar shock or stresses. Thank you. Over to you, Jane.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jerome and Jafar, for giving us that scene setting of what your 2 programs are doing. And I think with that, I'm going to pass it back to Jerome to kick us off with our first question.
Thank you. Thank you. So I just want to kickstart the session by trying now to pose it to RIPM. So I understand that RIPM has insights from key research efforts investigating the role of social connections in household ability to respond to the recent drought and other shocks or stresses. So from RIPM, what have you learned so far?
Thank you, Jerome, and thank you, everybody. So I'll start by setting the scene like the way I said with the ongoing drought when the research happened was in the 4th season. At that time, when we realized, trying to put into perspective the key shocks, apart from drought, households, 80% of them were experiencing drought. Remember in Somalia, people after droughts, they usually rely, the secondary thing is market to provide food. So the rising prices as a result of COVID and others made it more difficult for people to access food during this difficult period. With other shocks that were compounding, including unemployment at 56% and also malnutrition. So overall, this, with all that I've mentioned, this is the setting that this research happened. And RPM initially done a literature review on evidence of key capacities in Somalia. And before that 6 capacities, the topmost with the most evidence and impact was noted to be social connection. So we decided to investigate that during this drought to see how it works and what are the intricate common things that are coming out that can inform programming. So overall, some of the things that we find out is social connectedness is also one of the bases for resource sharing in Somalia. So access to different forms of support, especially loan, credit, and others, really were congregating around resource sharing. So also we have identified that the more connected a household was, the easier or the better they were in terms of accessing support from the community and also other external sources. So this includes like leveraging on diaspora, other community groups, and also securing also other access in terms of NGO support. So the other important thing was, and we had access to credit also come out that's connected to social connectedness, with the 2 factors being decisive in this process. So we have seen individuals that are well connected were able to get credit much faster vis-a-vis those who are not connected. The other thing also, households that were selected to receive external assistance from the support that the humanitarian assistance was given also were able to access credit faster as a result and share with others, thereby creating the creditworthiness. The 4th point I'll allude to is the social connectedness also has been the basis for support of the communities during this difficult time, with the psychosocial being usually least focused during this period of time. So in our survey, we found out 90% of the households during this period were facing either mental health or psychosocial support symptoms, either it is depression, sadness, or the rest. However, the most common support people got were primarily the close family members, the relatives, the community health workers, the traditional and the religious elders, which played a critical role. Another important point that I want to highlight before I go to my next slide is social connections in Somalia have been long existing, and they have been well documented in terms of responding or modifying the impacts of droughts. But remember, this drought was the longest with almost 6 consecutive. So this is something that the social connected systems are not, or the social networks are not used to. So this has really brought down issues of exhaustion of the capacity. So we have seen close to almost more than half, like 64% saying like, we are no longer getting support from the traditional social support systems that we usually relied on in this difficult period. And this is because the fact that during the 5th, the 6th rain season, we have seen this capacity getting eroded as a result of depletion. So this was a big issue in the sense that social connectors can support up to a certain level. So when you go to the survey results, some of the sources that people received support from, as you can see from your screen, like, more than half will not receive support, but the little that received support, they were able to play crucial as a part of the coping mechanism. And in this sense, we are seeing family and friends also playing a great role. Also, the role of non-governmental organizations came up clearly in this process, being the second most support that people receive from communities and groups also have been playing a critical role. And this has been a very critical point in across areas in Somalia and South Central specifically. So these are some of the support people received, and these highlights, like, if you add the support people are getting from family and from communities, that is close to 20 to 26%. So overall, next please. So this slide also was trying to see, despite getting support, what is the major form of support people are receiving from the neighbors, from all these social networks. So households also depend on each other. They received some both, as we talked about, intangible support. That's like the psychosocial that I talked about, but the tangible components that we were able to measure at this moment. The highest was food donations and people sharing the food that they have, as well as cash transfers and loans and credits were the topmost forms of support that people were able to receive during this period in time. So households use these networks to receive, also I talked about the intangible component of it. So overall, this is what we are seeing, and I'll ask back and Jerome. What about SomReP analysis, and how do these findings track with what you are seeing, and what's the difference and complementarity that you're seeing? Over to you, Jerome.
Thank you very much, Jafar. As indicated earlier on from the annual resilience measurement that we do, and specifically on the livelihood groups that we focus and work with, we are seeing, just like RIPM has observed, a heavy reliance on the traditional support mechanisms. So households are able to leverage on the existing networks as their primary support safety nets during shocks. So we saw that family, friends, and the broader community are able to support and help in the coping in the coping processes. But also we are seeing the reliance or the influence or benefits of the cultural financial mechanisms. So we have observed the continued role of mechanisms like Zakat and VSLA in providing support to the affected households. And these systems offer both immediate relief and a structure for resource pooling and redistribution, which underlines their cultural and financial importance during crisis. Next. So this is, as I indicated earlier on, it's a presentation of its data from our 3-year data from annual resilience measurement. And what we are quickly observing from that is that there is an overall varied different response or different reactions to the drought. So over time, the different livelihood groups have showcased different reactions. For example, just to speak to the agro-pastoralists, we have seen a significant drop in their confidence to support others from 47.8 in 2020 to 10% in 2022, which suggests a strain on their shared resources, which might be directly attributed to the drought's impact on agriculture. Similarly, an observation was made on the peri-urban, where there was a more gradual decline in their confidence from 24.3 to around 12 in 2020. And this also indicates that the repercussions of the drought are broad-reaching, affecting even those not directly involved in agriculture, such as the peri-urban. But a key thing that was observed was now specifically on the specifically the pastoralists. The pastoral households showcased a stable and even slightly increased confidence level from 24.3 in 2020 to 54 in 2022. And that shows their adaptability and potentially rooted in their nomadic lifestyle and shared resource culture. So this is something that was very interesting in our findings. And our data points to certain livelihood groups feeling potentially more isolated or vulnerable in recent years, specifically the agro-pastoralists and the peri-urban, while some households remain resilient, and this is specifically to the pastoral households. And others, obviously, as just observed by RIPM, there's signs of strain, indicating that the traditional support networks may be under pressure. But also, despite these challenges, there's that innate resilience of these communities. It continuously shines through. For example, the post-pastoral communities, for instance, leverage their inherent mobility and resource sharing culture to navigate through the impacts of the drought. Similarly, the urban communities, though impacted, have showcased adaptability, perhaps by seeking alternative income streams or support structures. Overall, from our data, we are observing that while the drought has undoubtedly exerted pressure on these communities, but their social connections remain a vital coping mechanism. The nuances and the shifts we are observing from these different livelihood groups underscore the importance of both reinforcing these traditional support structures, but also introducing adaptive strategies to enhance their further resilience to be strengthened. So that's what I can speak on what we're observing specifically from our data as SomReP. Over to you, Jen. Thank you.
That's so interesting. Thank you so much for these kind of first highlights from what you're seeing. I think it would be great to hear from others. And in particular, I'm thinking about what folks think about how these insights might affect the way in which we as practitioners design and target program interventions. And I know, Jafar, you have some initial thoughts to share on this. Do you want to kind of start us off on our group reflection? And I know Jerome also maybe has a couple of points to share. And I'm seeing the questions in the chat. I think these are highly relevant, so we'll get to those in just a second.
Jafar? Yeah, thank you, Jenny. And the next slide, I think, overall. So I'll try to speak to 2 points that are very critical in terms of implications for design and also targeting. So when we are trying to design programs specifically that address the unique needs of vulnerable groups, so such as elderly, disabled, the widow, and the rest who struggle to access resources and credit, the social connection, social connectedness plays a critical role. So as we try to do such targeted supports for vulnerable groups, we consider these groups also have these social networks that they also connect with, though the level of connection of these vulnerable groups usually are low. The other point that is critical that I wanted to start with is the issues to do around accountability and monitoring. Remember, as we try to do targeting, we need to also track issues of equitable distribution of resources. As you have heard from us, the more connected are more likely to also get access to our humanitarian programs more faster than the ones that are more vulnerable. So we ensure that we're able to keep an eye on ensuring the well-connected individuals and households do not disproportionately benefit, and also that resources are reaching those that are required equitably, while we know they are also suffering, but also we should be careful in that sense. Jerome, we can add to 1 or 2 points there.
Right, thank you very much, Jafar. I think I'll just speak to a few things. So from the data, what that we're observing from SomReP is that there's a need for specific tailored interventions for specific groups. It is evident that different livelihood groups have different reactions and resilience levels to drought, for example. So a one-size-fits-all approach might not be effective. So when designing programs should be designed considering these specific challenges and strengths of each livelihood group, but also just to also see how best the programs can build and reinforce social capital. The data is showing the importance of social connections during crisis, and intervention should focus not only on the immediate relief, but also on the long-term strategies to reinforce these particular social bonds and facilitating community-led support initiatives, and thereby strengthening the community safety nets. But also, this is over and above some targeting challenges that we might be facing, especially on how best we can reach the most vulnerable that we have seen as we are working in the communities. But there's just to underscore that, as I think RPM has also mentioned, there's that need for adaptive and feedback-driven strategies, where we are noting the shifting in the dynamics in community support capabilities, and therefore programs need to be adaptive, and regular feedback can help to monitor these shifts in community needs and allow for timely changes to intervention strategies. Thank you. Over to you.
That's super helpful. Yeah, thanks for framing this for us based on what you've already seen as effective when it comes to design and targeting, or just like the considerations that are so key to that. I'm seeing some really interesting questions from the audience. related to this question. I think the one from Asra Bekele is really pertinent to this. Asra, do you want to, or Bekele, do you want to ask it yourself, or I can read it out for you? You tell me. If you want to come off mute, feel free.
Yeah, kindly read for me if the question is clear.
That's fine. Yes, it's very clear. So Bekele is asking, in a context like Somalia, where shocks are so recurrent, is graduation out of safety net to a sustained resilience like actually practical? And can strong social cohesion in Somalia lay the groundwork for ultra poor graduation? So maybe just taking it from that design and targeting point of view, looking at targeting for ultra poor, designing for graduation. What are you guys seeing when it comes to like the role of social connectedness and how that might inform those decisions? Who has something yeah, go ahead, Jafar.
Yeah, I think when it comes to graduation and the role of safety nets, it's becoming apparent that when I speak about the evidences that we reviewed, close to 40 literatures that were produced in the past 7 to 10 years in Somalia on resilience, impacts of resilience programs and others, identified, one of the top 5 is safety nets. Apart from social connectedness, access to basic services, safety nets are also ranked very high, both formal and informal. So I think they are one of the capacities that really matter in Somalia, and if well designed and curated with accurate targeting, it can make a big difference in terms of graduating some of the people from the current shocks to a more sustainable situation. Bearing in mind, we have also large numbers of population that have been displaced as a result of these recurrent shocks that are unable to recover very well. So definitely there is a place for that, but that will going to depend on the design and targeting on the groups and how they are graduated and connected to the bigger market systems that do exist. Thank you.
And go ahead, Jerome. Do you have something to add?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think just to agree with what Jafar said, and just also to provide a context within SomReP, is that we take notes of the different livelihood groups and the different level at which they are. And in some cases, with the nature of the shocks and everything, there's a need of interventions that help these households to recover. But over and above that, there's also interventions that you target to build their resilience. So in SomReP, we use what we call layering and sequencing of activities, where looking at this level of which the household is, we are able to provide and target specific intervention to that household. And once that household is resilience is being built, we're able now to link them up to the next level of livelihood strategies that should be able to build their resilience. But we also understand that shocks are obviously recurrent, and therefore we build within our programming in SomReP what we call crisis modifier, where we take note that as houses their resilience is being built, there's going to be a shock that comes to affect that. So to avoid that household, dropping back to where they were, the crisis modifier comes in to cushion that particular household to avoid negative coping strategies or coping mechanisms, so that they still remain within. And then once the shock is over, then we continue to build from that existing place where we are building our interventions. So that's one element that we're trying to ensure, that there's that graduation, as I think as Aslat has put it, in the whole process. We are cognizant of the shocks, and therefore the crisis modifier comes in to absorb that, to cushion that in the case of those recurrent shocks. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I will just also note that we're going to dig deeper into the compounding shocks question in a future question. And I noticed that Denise responded to Azrat's question too, about like the way that social cohesion has taken a hard hit over the decades for a lot of different reasons. And we are going to look at that too, that sort of diminishing capacity when those shocks are compounded or recurrent. So we'll definitely have time to talk more about that in the future question clusters. I did see, also feel free to, turn on your cameras if you want. It's nice to see everyone, but understand if there are bandwidth issues. I did want to touch on another sort of design related question from Kelly Church. Kelly, do you want to ask your question or do you want me to read it out for you?
Hi, sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah, happy to ask. So not sure if this is relevant, but yeah, I'm the digital humanitarian advisor with BHA, and we are essentially doing a landscaping of programs that have digital components to them, and so wanted to see if this program, if any of the kind of social connectedness, if any of that is being facilitated by or expanded by the use of digital tools. Yeah, I guess that's my question. Thank you.
Great question. Who wants to take that? Any thoughts from? Go ahead, Jafar.
Yeah, I can start and I can give Jerome to take some. This is a very important question in the current age of digital world. So I'll speak to this in two folds. One is the local digital systems that have evolved over the past 10 years. Specifically, I will highlight the mobile money transfer systems that have been coming into place that has really not only facilitated but expanded the connection in the sense that people even in the far remote areas are able to have, with simple phones, are able to transact using these phones platforms. These are critically, as we're going to talk in our subsequent questions. Yeah.
We lost you for a second, I think.
Yeah, in the subsequent questions is the issue of remittances and how they have improved over time. So the social connectedness definitely has expanded and facilitated the networks. A critical example is the research that was done in 2011 after the famine, also in 2016, whereby communities who are more connected using both the diaspora resources through digital platforms were able to receive money faster and able to respond and also cope better. On the other tools is the current emergence of intermediate tools, sites, and others. While I know SomReP can speak to a bit of this, is the crowdsourcing systems that have started, like projects that can no longer be funded by organizations are crowdsourced through sites where people are able to contribute and build some of the key critical infrastructure and other programs that are going on. So definitely the digital component has significantly impacted on social connectors in terms of when it comes to safety net and other aspects of it. Thank you.
That's great. We have about 1 minute. Yeah, go ahead, Jerome.
So let me just quickly add. So as just highlighted by Jafar, in SomReP, we have taken advantage using the social cohesion, our connectedness with the technology, digital solutions. We have what we call Barwako. So Barwako is a platform where the communities, through our process of identification of priorities, what we call CAPs, once the communities identify priorities, then we move to the step of next level of implementation. And through that, then we provide what we call match funding. So this is where 70% is where SomReP comes in to support, but 30% of it is contributed by the community. And this is not in kind, this is in cash. So the communities, through the Barwako process, they're able to fundraise. And that's what I think Jafar was mentioning, crowdfunding. So they're able to crowdfund and they take advantage of the communities themselves being close-knit, but also the diaspora that are able now to support through this platform, crowdfunding platform. And we have seen cases where communities are able to fundraise more than $15,000 for a project within their community. And through Barwako, they're able to see in real time as funds are coming, but even as projects are also being implemented, the structures and everything. So that's one platform that we have seen how we have utilized the social connectedness and the digital platforms. So I think because of time, let me stop there. Thank you.
No, that's fantastic. I really love these examples. They help kind of illuminate how these things can be facilitated and supported by the design decisions that we make as practitioners. I see questions from Pierce and Caroline that, if with your permission, I think might relate to our next group reflection opportunity around implementation and the things to consider for that. So for the moment, I'm going to park those questions for the next reflection and hand it back over to Jerome to ask our next question of each.
So I think just to build up from there, these reflections on strength and engagement with local actors prompts the question, in what ways does the data provide insight into how locally led initiatives support shock-affected households? So I think LRPM, you can speak to that, how locally led initiatives support shock-affected households. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerome, and also Jenny for leading this discussion. So one caveat I want to put out is that although we are focusing on locally led initiatives, remember these systems are usually interconnected and the integral components of bigger systems that we are currently working on. So one major interesting thing that I will speak to is the issue of remittances support systems and also fundraising. So our drought formative research indicated that both the internal and external remittances were both affected. Remember, during the drought period, we had the local, the externally, we had the post-conflict, the start of conflict for Ukraine, and then we also had the COVID, the impacts, the wearing off of the COVID impacts affecting the diaspora community. So one interesting thing is that both local remittances and external remittances were actually at the same percentage, at 3%. So that shows, like, these local systems, people sharing within and people sharing externally were really connected. And that means, like, these local systems are not immune itself from, other bigger systems that are out there. And that was critical in the sense that it provided support during difficult times like this, so which was affected. Also, during the same time, also we are doing the research, it came up clearly that there were fund drives that were being conducted by committees that are either set up locally by people through the local administration or regional governments targeting contributions. So trying to ask, key enterprises such as the big banks, like the Shil, Amal, and Golis, and Ormud, to get involved and try to provide, early support to people who have been affected by this drought. So locally, we have seen, religious leaders also calling for the contribution of or the collection of, charity, so that people are able to survive and also give that. So this also facilitated the leverage on sharing the little resources they had at local level. The other thing that we talked about is obviously the Islamic concept of zakat, which is the alms, giving of alms and also food distribution. So we have seen that the drought, during the drought, and households leveraged on this assistance, where the less privileged were able to access a bit of this distribution or redistribution of food by some of the better off communities. So this act of kindness, although it's a religious act, but also social connection aspects of it. And then finally, I come back down to this issue came out a lot, is the psychosocial component, whereby we found out that community-based personnel, such as the community health workers, community animal health workers, the community hygiene workers, and all these case workers were playing critical role in terms of responding to the psychosocial needs, in terms of providing counseling, hope, all these to this group of people who are affected at local level before even our interventions came in. Remember, the gap in psychosocial support is close to 80% of the people or 90% of the people are affected, and only only less than 15% were able to access this support from both our programs or even all other sources. So overall, this is how locally led initiatives are connected to these social systems. And some of the humanitarian agency programs recruited individuals for maybe to help them with hygiene promotion, but they ended up working, providing as part of the community, providing counseling service, since people are turning up to them during this difficult time. So those are some of the interesting things that we have seen that are connected to locally led initiatives. So I'll try to ask, I'll get back and see what SomReP has done. So from your data, in terms of local led initiatives, Jerome, that support resilience outcomes, particularly when it comes to social cohesion, are there any barriers or unintended outcomes that we are seeing? Over to you, Jerome.
Thank you, Jafar. So in terms of our observation, especially from the data, as echoed previously, at the heart of local resilience are traditional support mechanisms. And these indigenous mechanisms often serve as a first response systems, providing immediate relief during shocks like drought. So we have seen that in our data. And also our data suggests that cultural practices, especially in Somali community, play pivotal role. Friends, families, and broader community ties act as the primary support pillar. These are primary support pillars. And these long-standing traditions built over generations have been instrumental in offering a safety net during hard times. But also, we have seen that locally led initiatives often harness local knowledge and practices that have been time-tested. The evidence is there. And for example, we have just talked about how we have seen from the data how pastoral communities have showcased adaptability, potentially rooted in their nomadic lifestyle and culture of resource sharing. So such intrinsic knowledge plays a very vital role in crafting solutions tailored specifically to the community's unique needs. But also, our data is showing that some community segments or livelihood segments hint at feeling more isolated or vulnerable in recent years. And while the reasons might be multifold, but it underscores the need for locally led initiatives to ensure that interventions do not exclude or overlook certain community segments or livelihood groups. So this is what we are seeing, and on the unintended and barriers in terms of outcomes, I'll speak more to this, I think, in the next reflection or questions. But we are also seeing some of the barriers and unintended outcomes. Over to you.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I was having the same thought that yeah, I think Spencer's question we can definitely get into during question 3. It would be great to hear from others, and in particular, I'm thinking about the reality that you've both reflected on about how the kind of vast majority of assistance that allows households to cope and survive is not necessarily externally led formal assistance, but those informally planned and mobilized by local actors. And beyond the support that's mobilized informally between households, there are other locally led initiatives that are providing life-saving support and adaptation assistance in this context. So I think let's open it up and just ask, like, how do we think these findings might impact the way we as practitioners are implementing programs in communities? And I know that, I think, Jerome, you have a couple of thoughts to tee us up with that question.
Yes.
Yeah, go for it.
So just a few additional observations on social connectedness. I think Jafar spoke to it, but specifically for us, we observed that communities in the northern region were severely impacted by the floods. That was between November and December 2019. And the situation was even worse in 2020 because now COVID restrictions were introduced. And even what was made it worse was the closure of those international livestock markets. There was also the devaluation of the shilling and the cross-border trade. That really compounded all this, really had an impact on the households. And one key thing that we noted, and I mentioned earlier on about how we ensure that our households do not go back or slide back by adopting negative coping mechanisms. We introduced crisis modifier. So we noted that the transfer values during crisis, they are often inadequate. And this is exhibited by they are susceptible to price shocks. So as the transfer values, the amounts that are being provided to the households to really cushion them in the crisis and against the shocks, the amount is really affected, and it reduces the willingness of these households to be able to share this with their families or their community. And we know that, and we are not that while there's the intention to share is there, but the resources are there being available, are they being strained or limited, that in a way affect the need for them to share, indicating that social connected does not always lead to actual support. There's that intention to share, but also there's that challenge in terms of the available resources that they can use to be able to share. So that is one key thing that we noted. The transfer values being affected by so many things, the multiplicity of shocks that the households were facing, and how now they are willing to share, but they can't because of the limited resources available. And we see that from our end in terms of programming, that crisis modifier as a key intervention to cushion the households has to be designed in a way that it responds to the shock intensity or shock intensity, so that it is really responsive to that shock intensity rather than not selecting a few households. So that's what I can contribute on what we are observing on this aspect. Thank you.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you, Jerome. And I think it speaks very closely to Caroline's earlier question, and also the question that Spencer just flagged as well around the sort of negative and positive aspects of that sharing or borrowing. Do either of you want to come off mute and sort of ask your question, Caroline? I know you kind of posed it first.
Hi, this is Caroline. Thanks.
Sure.
I work with the USA's Bureau for Resilience and Food Security project, and part of that is leading research on livelihood coping strategies. And I'm really interested whether you all, Jerome and Jafar, would consider asking or borrowing money and food to be a coping strategy at all, and if so, how that's folded into measurement considerations. Is it positive? Is it negative? Interested in your thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you for the question. I think we will going to split the way we ask this in surveys to ensure that we are able to capture this very well, and also ensure that it's not interpreted negatively. We usually borrowing is considered a positive coping strategy because households borrow from each other and also borrow from local merchants on credit, and also borrow a lot of things among themselves with the hope of either repaying that or even repaying in kindness, in the sense of either giving back similar during when they are well off. That we consider that on borrowing as a positive coping strategy. But when it comes to asking, that is like, we call it more of begging. So begging is a negative coping mechanism, as you have seen. A lot of people came to town, they continue to beg, they get used to that, they continue doing with no intentions of either going back or even trying to even recover from things after even they beg and the crisis is over. So we classify in that manner and explicitly ask the two in that sense, so that we're able to capture the difference and classify them in that manner. Jerome, you can add if I've missed anything.
Yeah, I think you rightly answered. Just to add from what you just said, yes, from our measurement, borrowing is one of the coping mechanisms, and we measure that, and we really find out what coping mechanism the households are using, and borrowing is part of that. And just like you have just read the report, when we are analyzing the household well-being outcomes, debt is one of the indicators or metric that we measure to see how the household has been impacted with a shock, or in other words, to measure shock intensity. And it comes in or factors in as a negative coping mechanism. So I think one key element that needs to come out is on the issue of borrowing. In the asking, I think from our end, it is not clear whether this borrowing is in the form of debt, or I don't know how the household is going to pay back such. So that's something that's a missing element, so that we are able to link it up to whether it's a negative or coping. But as we start and when we are even calculating the index, we take borrowing as a positive coping mechanism. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that sounds, I mean, there are a lot of different layers to that and ways to look at it. And then we will get into monitoring later. So maybe that will also get to the other part of Caroline's question. But this is also feels really relevant to Spencer's question in the chat. And I know, Jerome, you touched on this already when it came to sort of transfer values. But Spencer, do you want to come off mute and ask your question, or do you want me to read it out for you? Either one. He was, I'm not sure if he's still on, but he was basically asking for a little bit more sort of detail around what the research may be revealing in terms of negative aspects of social connection, like excessive pressure on a small number of households to share, which you guys have touched upon a little bit. And then disputes over allocations is what made me think of the transfer values question. Anything you can highlight that you're seeing when it comes to sort of any negative aspects of the social connectedness that you haven't already mentioned?
Yeah, I think on the question of the negative impacts, I can give an analogy around, a life vest. So when you have a number of life vests, there's only a couple of people that you can help. And that means like, if you had 10, you can only help 10 people. And in the event that more than 10 arrive, maybe I will put exact pressure on the person whom can help. And knowing that this system is also somehow over-exhausted, so the number of people you help drastically reduce. And this may open up other questions like, whether people are exerted, although our research has not identified that, but that means like, the other options are available, other things will come up, including whether it's disputes of allocations, even including access to humanitarian services or access to resources. We have usually seen conflicts arising during these difficult periods, specifically in pastoral areas where people used to share resources. Now that they are becoming smaller and smaller, people use their social networks to defend the little they have when it comes to the rangelands in that sense. So in some ways, social networks sometimes can be used negatively in the sense of mobilizing and spearheading, or even making conflict go worse in the sense of people using their networks to call others in the sense of defending their resources, which gets escalated and gets out of hand. So also with these components of also like, other than state actors, when it becomes difficult, they put exact pressure on these social networks so that they're able to extract the little they have. So that's also an issue of sometimes negative coping, some of the negative aspects that we can allude to. But our research was never intended to identify that, but we were only looking on the concepts of how it's used and how better can it be utilized with it by programs. Thank you.
That's great. Anything to add to that? Okay.
So I think just to add, I think it might be a repetition, but just to add that I think as we are observing from the transfer values, obviously it gets to be affected by the inflation issues, but also over time not being inadequate to support. From our experience in SomReP, when we usually use transfer values specifically in response to shocks. We target a specific group within our target locations. In this case, we do not just get everyone who is part of the program in SomReP, but we take a specific group based on our vulnerability analysis. So we, for example, the last time we were able to target 33% of the households. What we do that to ensure that as transfer values, they should not be a norm in a way. We are trying to build the resilience of the household. So we are able to see at what level the household is before we actually put them or include them in the transfer values. And it's a way of trying them not to their situation not to worsen off. But over time, we are making sure that these transfer values are meant to build the resilience, but not to build the dependence over time. So that's basically, we move from that premise in terms of using transfer values. And in most cases, I think, just to speak to the previous case, obviously it's different when it comes to drought, but we do transfer values, and we utilize transfer values, especially when we're doing the community programs. For example, is it Cash for Work? So this is basically for these projects where the communities are also contributing not only in kind but in cash. But this Cash for Work is now specifically as they are working on that particular construction or infrastructure building. So that's how we approach transfer values, being cognizant of the negative effect that it might have over time. Thank you.
And that's really helpful. Thanks. I'm seeing some really interesting like contributions in the chat. The one from Mohammed Abdul Qadir about the VSLA work that World Vision has been doing in Somalia. So that's really interesting example to share. As well as Denise's comment about the differences in terms of diaspora support for community projects between regions, where she hasn't been seeing that much in like Honduras, I think is the example. Pierce, I thought maybe pass it over to you just in the last couple of minutes we have for this question session. You made a really interesting comment about sort of the history of gifting and loaning, which I think is great, but maybe just to go back to your original question around mobility and how that might affect sort of implementation of resilience programming for pastoralists in particular. Do you want to come off mute and ask that question? Or?
Thanks, Jen, and good afternoon, everyone. In a way, both aspects are related. Is perhaps the pressures put on pastoralist societies and agro-pastoralist societies in the more recent times, because a lot of these mobility and gifting, historically, it's had a huge role, but increasingly both are getting more difficult. I think we're seeing shifts in terms of the numbers of people in the different wealth groups. So basically the number of rich people is reducing, the number of poor and very poor people are probably increasing. So the demands on those that can are getting so great that it's difficult to actually fulfill the needs. And at the same time, even if you look at the herd sizes of the rich these days, they're much smaller than the rich in the decades and 50 years ago. So even their ability to help the number of people is reducing. So I think they're connected, and it's just interesting to see how they will change in current times. Back to you.
Yeah, that's a really helpful reflection. We are going to also get into in our next question sort of the changing sort of conditions that are informing or affecting social connectedness and households' capacity or ability to engage and leverage that connection. Maybe with that, it's a good transition point to move on to our third question. And I think Jafar is going to kick us off this time. Over to you.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Jenny. So, Jerome, we know that the last drought is in Somalia surely will not be the last. As you have seen, there are always recurrent droughts. And also, droughts are not the only shock, and Somalia and the Horn, all these are we are contending with. It's exceptionally difficult with high food prices, shortages, the wars that are going on insecurity and conflict, and also reverberating the economic and social impacts of COVID. So how do you see the role of social connectedness to these recurrent compounding shocks? And what are we learning from your research and on opportunities to better monitor and account for these social effects on social connectedness? Over to you, Jerome.
Thank you very much, Jafar. So just to kickstart that, in cases, with the case of Somalia, where we have recurrent shocks and different kinds of shocks, we are seeing that in such cases, most of the times people will look at the formal structures. And what we are also observing is that in cases where formal support structures might be lacking or overwhelmed, the social connections become the primary safety nets. So families, friends, and community networks, they pull resources together and share that information and provide emotional support during crisis. The recent one that I can just highlight is what we're observing with the floods that are happening. So through anticipatory action and sharing of information, there's a lot of sharing of information which helps even households to be able to respond and to act on such information to avoid even worse catastrophe. So that's one thing that we are observing, that households, our communities, are remaining resilient through this community support when these formal support structures are not there or they're overwhelmed. But also, these social connections facilitate the dissemination of crucial information, as just I said about. This applies both in terms of the incoming aid, even market prices of safe zones during conflicts. So this is where the connections, we are in the digital era where through these social connections, there's that dissemination of crucial information. And this grassroots level communication can often be the most effective and immediate than the formal channels. And basically seeing how best we can tap on this particular existing indigenous ways, especially with that comes with social connection. But also in the face of challenges like high food prices, inflation, even shortage of external shocks from external factors, social connections are good in as a resource to facilitate resource pooling. I've just provided that example in one of the reflections about crowdfunding. So we in SomReP, we have as part of our interventions of the crowdfunding project, the blackboard that I mentioned earlier on, Bushakab. And we also ensure that we also facilitate that each community should have a contingency fund. So this is a fund where in case of an emergency or in case of a shock, this fund is activated. So this fund is held by an early warning committee and is the available funds are periodically deposited at a bank. And the community can activate these particular contingency funds once there is that particular shock. And we are seeing that we're using this social cohesion that the community is able to contribute and to match the funds with what SomReP is available to provide. And then use that as a first point of support before the formal support comes through. And we are leveraging on these social connections especially to build on these particular groups like producer groups, associations or collectives for saving mechanisms such as VSLA. And with the multiplicity of shocks and stresses, the insecurity, the conflict, and even the aftermath of COVID-19 epidemic, the effects have not just been physical, but also profoundly psychological. I think my friend from Jafar has spoken about that. These social connections now comes in as very invaluable. They provide that emotional support, a sense of belonging, and often trauma counseling through shared experiences. So this is how we are seeing social connection is coming in to help households to cope. But also social connections can lead to community-driven solutions to offset some of the economic challenges, especially from the impacts of COVID-19. So this might include the communal business ventures. This is very common in Somalia, or shared farming or fishing projects. And this is where now when you interventions such as cooperative markets or cooperatives, these are key in terms of now building that and cushioning the households in terms of shock. But in terms of now some of the barriers and the intended outcomes, there are key things that we are observing. I think that's been mentioned already, but let me just highlight a few. The issue of strain on the shared resources, we are seeing that as one of the barriers. The data indicates that these shared resources, essential for mutual support, might be under increasing strain due to the prolonged drought. So that's something that is there as one of the key barriers or unintended outcomes. But also the ripple effects of droughts extends beyond even to all the livelihood groups, even they are not directly involved. For example, with the drought, we talk about agriculture. So they face the repercussions like increased food prices, highlighting that traditional support systems might not always be fully equipped to handle broader economic impacts of environmental crises. But also the economic challenges that we are seeing, the direct impact on the livelihood due to droughts, potentially hinder the capacity of these households to support each other. And this suggests that while these social bonds remain strong, the economic challenges that they are being faced with are significant and obviously pose a barrier in actual support. And we, just as a conclusion, that while we understand that locally led initiatives rooted in traditional local knowledge have been instrumental in fostering resilience and social cohesion, but there's evidence of challenge. There are challenges. There's obviously challenges that these communities are facing, and these act as barriers. In this case, to some of the actions of some of the support that they can provide. And there's a need now for more integrated approach, where we can blend the traditional wisdom with innovative strategies to address that multifaceted challenges that is being posed by shocks like drought, floods, and even COVID-19. So let me stop there and pass it on to Jafar. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerome. I think you have touched on a couple of great points. So I'll just try to conclude the points on this one as we continue. So overall, I think the big message is that social connectedness empower communities to thrive amidst adversity overall. So I would like to highlight that social connectedness is a critical coping mechanism. So it serves as a coping mechanism during different recurrent and compounding shocks. So it enables both individuals and households to access support and when facing multiple challenges during this difficult period, as we have alluded to in our previous submissions or discussions, that we had seen that social connectedness be a critical coping mechanism that needs to be monitored. The other thing is resource availability. Overall, when we talk about social connectedness, it provides a pathway to access a wide range of resources. We are not only talking here about financial support only, we're talking about labor support, information sharing, which are crucial in responding to recurrent droughts. This is clearly articulated in the research that households that are aware, others that have received help, and where have they received from, makes even importance, like people are able to know where are the sources of support outside within the networks. Specifically, about, I think, 40% were aware of where the other colleagues who are able to be supported by our programs were able to access. So it shows like a form of accessibility and provides that kind of mobility to it. And then aspects of community cohesion. So it fosters community sense of cohesion. It encourages both multiple mutual support and collaboration among households, which is essential in our collective resilience in the face of ongoing challenges. It also builds, it has contributed to, as I have alluded before with the research, that the ton of body that's out there, that it enhances, one way it enhances resilience is but it facilitates risk sharing and resource sharing among communities, so allowing them to better withstand the impacts of different shocks and crises. Finally, these shocks are usually, as we have talked about, compounding and also complicated, sometimes intricate and connected. So the social connections also are adapting with that, so they are versatile. So and they also they're inclusive, although not 100%. So they're inclusive to some level whereby they are aware of each other. So regardless of that, they're able to connect with each other and also provide with the support that's required at different difficult times. So this makes fundamentally is the assets in this difficult period of time is that people are able to use assets for different purposes, whether it's lending, borrowing, selling also, and all of this. So social networks play a critical role in how that manifests itself in terms of coping mechanism. So they are versatile in the sense that we have seen, Jerome, people in the pastoral nature have been trying to take a positive note now that they are able to understand these recurrent shocks and be able to make use of the information that they get. So overall, that's how usually we are seeing it as social connection. Also, I would like to highlight that we are just finished a bigger survey currently where we are digging deep into some of these aspects that we touched in details, like trying to understand how intricate these social connections are and how are they interconnected and what makes them more versatile than the others. And in some regions where they are more versatile than the others. So we're hopefully in subsequent sessions where we're able to showcase those examples. So with those few remarks, I'd like to just pause here and give back to Jenny to lead us on the final reflection of the day.
Thanks so much, both of you. That's a really great kind of digging into these questions. And we wanted to, offer up some space again to do some group reflection around these insights. And we sort of framed it specifically to look at maybe how these findings and insights might change our approach as practitioners to monitoring specifically, but certainly there have been a lot of really interesting comments and questions in the chat, so it's not limited to that. But one sort of conversation that's happening in the chat that I thought might be relevant, even potentially to monitoring, is the ongoing sort of conversation around the dynamics of migration. And I see some really great comments from Denise and from Piers again about that, just kind of highlighting international migration has become like an escape valve, as Denise puts it, and that social networks may become further eroded due to out-migration or international migration, and Piers had also commented on that. Denise, did I capture that sort of question, just framing of like maybe what the impacts are for migration, or do you want to come off mute and pose it better than I have? Oh, okay, that's great. So yeah, maybe if either of you could speak to like the impacts of migration on social connectedness, and maybe talk about, reflect on Piers's response that, the pairing of migration with remittances might mean that strong social connectedness actually remains into the future because they're connected despite multiple shocks. It's just flagging as something that's worth watching. But any reflections around migration, remittances, and the effects on social networks, social connectedness? Whichever of you would like to.
So I can just start from what we're observing from the data, even from when we conduct some monitoring visits. So one of the things that we observed, in the SomReP location is that we had done interventions, and these interventions included building multi-water use points. So these multi-water use points acted as an anchor in most of the times to the community, especially in the face of the drought, this multi-seasonal drought. So what happened was that we noted an influx of migration, especially from the neighboring communities or neighboring locations coming into SomReP locations. It's had its own challenges because we noted that this really put a lot of pressure on the resource, and that is a recipe for conflict. So that's one of the things that we really noted. But one of the things that we also did was to ensure that these committees that are managing these, from these locations that are managing these water points, were trained both in terms of conflict resolution, but also in terms of them just managing the water point. And one thing that came in very clear during the drought, especially when it comes to social connectedness, is that when we visited one location and we asked them how did they handle the influx of some communities during the drought, they said that as a community and as a committee, they were able to come up with their bylaws, or I'll call them bylaws, where if the people that have migrated within their locations are staying less than a month, they were able to provide the support. And this was in terms of access to the water point. So they were able to provide that access to water point. But as part of managing that water point, that resource, they were, as a community, they were contributing as a way of sustainability, they were contributing towards maintenance, a certain amount. So any other community members that have migrated to their location and are staying more than a month, now they were requested to be able to contribute towards that sustainability. So that's one thing that we have noted through social connectedness, that's that they were able to see the people that migrated as one of them, and able to provide the immediate relief, which is by providing them access to the water point. But over time, they were also able to use their social connection to see how best they can get that water resource. So that's one thing that we have noted, especially when it comes to migration issues. And I think I'll speak to that. I understood the question from Piers differently, so let me pause there for now. Yeah, thank you.
And apologies to both you and Jafar. I realized that I skipped over some of your framing talking points for this reflection session. So I jumped straight to the audience questions. But do you want to quickly, Piers, is there something you'd like to kind of clarify from your question? I don't know that I framed it correctly.
I think it's really just that international migration, I think, is increasingly important for a lot of families. We might see it as economic migration, but in a way it's a coping strategy for the bigger family. It's not necessarily totally moving out of the livelihood. It's just looking at an alternative source of support to the family. Previously, most societies were unable to migrate away from the problem sufficiently. It would be sort of within country or just regional migration. But this global migration, I think, yeah, it does offer opportunities, and I don't know how the world will respond to it. Back to you.
Yeah, that's a good point. Again, I did skip over Jerome and Jafar. Do you want to quickly go back to the presentation and give a couple of quick thoughts specific to this reflection question before we take more questions from the chat? What do you think?
I think from my presentations, I had spoken to them as I was in the previous. Yeah, so I think it's fine for me.
Okay, Jafar, would you like to? Yeah, please.
I'd like to highlight 2 points as it applies to monitoring and the question on the group about the group. How will this affect our monitoring approaches? So overall, I would like to highlight 2 items. So we really required to be dynamic in the sense of measuring these aspects. So we need to recognize like social networks are dynamic in nature during a crisis. So the other thing is that we have a lot of challenges in the sense of we only try to study social networks or social connectedness during crisis period, and we have a ton of gap in the sense of what does social connectedness look like in the stable periods, and to highlight, that the need of adapting our methods to capture that during non-crisis period to see how social connectedness assesses, our works with the work that we're doing before. In crisis it really works. It provides some form of support, but we don't know much about it during when there is a crisis. So during stable periods, that's a big gap that we have seen, and as we try to do subsequent measurements, we'll try to see how it works. But also from program monitoring, we can look at it. The other point I will highlight of importance is the issue of what's the external aid impact on social connectedness. So we monitoring should also.
Sorry, I've lost audio.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Jerome?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. So on the second point that I wanted to highlight is the external impact of external aid impact. So monitoring should also consider aspects of how external aid is influencing these social networks. We have heard of issues to do with, we cannot reach everybody. We do targeting, selective targeting. We have seen areas and challenges where when we talk about we are targeting this group for this purpose, people will say we are all in the same problem. Why don't you just give us uniformly? So we need to also understand, how our support or our external aid support is really impacting on this, and whether it's either disrupting or also strengthening this critical resource for resilience. The other aspect is I think one of the questions asked about in the group, I could see Hope asked about gender and age. So these social networks are traditional in nature and usually are patriarchal and have been dominated by elders, and also the role of youth, women, and also younger generations is currently carving out. It's not well evolved, has been dominated by that group, despite the fact that Somalia has 70% of its population is youth, which is means like, definitely they're trying to carve their space within these social networks. And we also need to capture that in our M&E system to see how they're playing a critical role in terms of where these groups are involved. Although in some aspects they may be excluded, or also in areas where they're included, what does that mean and how does it really impact on the infrastructure of the social connectedness? On the final point, I think we should focus in terms of risk strategies. Monitoring should focus on assessing the effectiveness of the risk sharing, the support mechanisms within social systems, and how is that really making our work, either how is it modifying our work in the sense of what we are doing, because we are operating with this system that usually is complex, has a lot of moving parts, but also is a risk sharing mechanism. So in that sense, it's important to look at some of these 4 points I highlighted. So thank you. I think I can pass to Jerome or Jennifer, whoever is ready.
Go ahead, Jerome. We have about 3 or 4 minutes left. So if you have something, but I definitely know that there are some questions in the chat. Go ahead.
So just to quickly put it, so one of the things that we're doing in SomReP as a way of ensuring that we take note of this specific, so for example, social connectedness in our programming and our monitoring, is that we have a feedback mechanism. And this feedback mechanism involves communities providing feedback to our to the interventions that we're implementing. And this feedback now is incorporated and addressed even in the intervention programming. But over and above that, in terms of monitoring, we have community level monitoring where the communities and the federal member state government staff are able to go and monitor implementation of the interventions. And from there, we have real-time learning with them and with the communities, but also the government to do that. Even at the federal level, we also conduct annually a joint monitoring together with the government to appreciate the interventions and also to find what are the learnings coming from the implementation and what can be improved. And through this, we're ensuring that the monitoring process provides that ground level insights and culturally appropriate methodologies as we continue to implement. And over and above that, this is done to ensure that our monitoring system is adaptive to the feedback that is being provided, adaptive to any changing community dynamics and needs that might be there as we continue to work and monitor together with the community. But over and above that, we also continue to utilize technological solutions. So this is where we're using technology, for example, GS mapping and everything, just to provide all the real-time data insights and track shifts in community needs over time. And I think the best example is where we are currently doing what we call flood incident monitoring. As the floods are happening, we are monitoring and reporting, and so that we can really target resources where there's the most need and being responsive to such. So I think I just wanted to highlight that as part of the ways of trying to see how we can adapt our approach to monitoring with regards to the social connected. Thank you.
That's really important and useful insight. Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left. I want to get to a cluster of questions that I think will be relevant for this reflection session. And in the meantime, I want to just let people know that we've got a survey we're dropping the link to in the chat now. And we'd love to have your thoughts, not only on how this went for you today, but also we intend to do a bit of a series around this, these research findings that are coming out of these two programs, start to carry on next year. And so we've also got a question there to get your input on how best to carry this conversation forward. So I'd really appreciate your insights on that survey. And then I wanted to go back to a pair of questions that we've got about sort of like how to map things out. So Caroline asks a question about defining the livelihood zones, you know, agropastoral, pastoral, peri-urban, and how households are classified based on where they live, their self-declared primary livelihood or other criteria. And then Eric was asking something in a similar vein, I thought, around like initial social mapping to see what resources or groups are available to promote social connectedness to begin with. And does the program serve as a vehicle to connect people to groups? Do you create groups that encourage ongoing and regular contacts between people, et cetera? So sort of that mapping and understanding what the opportunities even are when it comes to leveraging social connectedness and how we categorize different groups. Does somebody want to take that first? Jerome, go ahead.
Oh, yes, I can go ahead with that. So from SomReP, basically, livelihood zones are characterized by their primary livelihood. In this case, their primary livelihood. So, for example, for pastoralists, these are communities whose primary livelihood depends on livestock rearing. And as indicated in the presentation, they are more nomadic or semi-nomadic. Just movement patterns are dictated by the search for pasture or water. And in this case, in terms of settlement or classification where there are locations, it is predominantly geographical in the case of Somalia, where some locations or regions are known to be predominantly pastoral communities, and others are predominantly agropastoral. Similarly, I think for agropastoral, these are communities that are purely engaged in both farming and also livestock rearing. And there are known communities that are known as agropastoral in terms of land use patterns, the types of crops grown, and also the presence or the importance of livestock in their economy, and how these elements integrate within the household's livelihood strategies. Similarly, I think for the peri-urban, these are typically at the outskirts of the urban areas, and their livelihoods are more diverse, and this include a mixture of agricultural, self-service-based or industrial activities, and these might be even small-scale businesses, and they are often have greater access to markets. So they are living in the outskirts. They can do several things, and they quickly go and access markets or services and employment opportunities. And these are specifically like the peri-urban, those communities or livelihood zones that we usually target them with, for example, TVET interventions and everything as part of the resilience or diversifying their livelihoods. So these are purely, the classification is purely based on their main livelihood, but also with the way Somalia is set up, with their known regions that are predominantly pastoral, agropastoral, and those that are on the outskirts of urban centers, those are the ones that we call now peri-urban. And I think one of the zones that I do not present here because we work with a very isolated on one side is the fisher folk. So these are purely those that are predominantly along the coast, and they are into fishing. And we work with one area in Il. That's where we have the fisher folk livelihood. So it's predominantly their main livelihood, and geographical locations also play a key role in that. Thank you.
Thanks, that's great.
I'm not sure if I missed anything.
No, I think that's great. I think we're just out of time. I'm just dropping a link where you can sign up for our newsletter. And I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. And in particular, Jerome and Jafar for their incredible and rich insights and reflections. Jafar, do you have anything quickly you wanted to add before we wrap up? No, you're good. I'm sorry, we did run out of time, but not surprising based on how much incredible information there was to share with everyone today. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Fantastic conversation and really, really interesting data and findings being shared. To be continued. We definitely want to carry this forward in a series to keep tracking what we're finding and what these two important programs are discovering.